A potential act of terror is being investigated in France after a machete-wielding man attacked officers close to the Louvre. The assailant was reportedly heard shouting "God is great" in Arabic. French President François Hollande warns Donald Trump not to meddle in the EU's internal affairs, saying his country has a strong defense policy and that it's not dependent on its allies.
Nous, la France, we in France have a defense policy. We fear nothing.
At a summit in Malta, EU leaders forge a plan to stem the flow of migrants from North Africa while simultaneously attacking Donald Trump's immigration ban. And Britain's defense secretary lashes out at Russia, claiming it deliberately lies and that its intervention in Syria has not primarily been about targeting Islamic State. Watching RT International, coming to you live from Moscow with me, Marina Joshi, and we begin with an update of our breaking news story from France this hour, where police have opened an investigation into a possible terror attack after a man assaulted police officers near the entrance to a shopping center close to the Louvre Museum in Paris. The man shouted "God is great" in Arabic.
As I speak at the Carrousel du Louvre, an officer tasked with providing security to the Louvre Museum was visibly assaulted as part of an attempted attack which was terrorist in its nature.
The incident took place on Friday morning as a man tried to enter the shopping center with two backpacks. When an officer asked him to open the bags, the man assaulted the officer with a knife. In response, police shot the man. He's said to be seriously wounded in hospital. Charlotte Dubensky is in Paris for us.
It feels as if calm has returned to this part of Paris just a few hours after that incident took place at the Louvre, which is just a few feet behind me. There have been crowds gathering throughout this morning. Those roads are closed off. Some of the roads have been reopened to allow traffic through, but the roads around the Louvre itself remain closed, as does the museum. That museum this morning, the centre, the shopping centre near that museum was where that attack took place. Police are treating this incident as a terrorist incident, and they will now be investigating the background of this man, finding out who he is, where he's come from, and why he decided to carry out this attack at one of Paris's most popular tourist spots, the Louvre Museum. And we have heard from the mayor of Paris that there will be increased security at major tourist spots around this city, and there already was heightened security here in Paris. France is in a national state of emergency following several attacks in 2015, including that night of terror here in Paris, which saw 130 people killed. The mayor's office is saying that there will be a further increased presence of police and security at tourist hotspots to try and ensure that tourists feel as safe as possible in one of the world's most visited cities.
That was our correspondent Charles Dubensky there in Paris, and we're of course closely following this story, and we'll continue to bring you all the latest updates as we get them here on RT International. In the meantime, the UK's defense secretary has warned of a resurgent Russia and said that it is becoming aggressive. Michael Fallon made the comments as he addressed a group of university students. Anastasia Churkina has more.
Well, UK Defence Secretary Michael Fallon spoke at St Andrews University, where he certainly had a lot to say on Russia, including through the use of the Russian language, where the Secretary showed lots of knowledge and skill.
Another feature of Russian activity is the elevation of what Churchill called the terminological inexactitude to an art form. There is a special Russian word for this, not maskirovka, the old deception perpetrated by its intelligence agencies, but vranyo, where the listener knows the speaker is lying, and the speaker knows the listener knows he is lying, but keeps lying anyway.
Well, ironically, one doesn't have to dig too deep to find certain discrepancies in terms of what Fallon had to say himself, from things like saying that the MH17 tragedy took place in June rather than July, to certain exaggerated statements on Syria.
Its intervention in September 2015 was not to target Daesh terrorists, but to shore up the ailing Assad regime, demonstrated by 80% of its airstrikes being conducted against non-Daesh targets. Since then, Russia has targeted the Syrian opposition in Aleppo with little regard for innocent lives.
Well, let's keep in mind that Russia stopped its airstrikes on Aleppo back in October, that the Syrian president himself had asked Russia to get involved in the fight against terrorism, which certainly legitimizes Russia's activities there to that extent. We also know that according to existing data from January, Russian strikes had destroyed over 370 oil-related ISIS locations at headquarters, as well as had cleared over 12,000 square kilometers of territory of terrorist presence. Now, back to Ukraine. Michael Fallon said that Russia did not allow Ukraine to decide its own destiny. Now, this was in relation to elections, so it's not really clear what was meant there, considering it's hard to say how Russia could have gotten involved in the presidential elections there, and certainly the entire world was watching that whole process of the swap of power. And, of course, last but not least, on NATO, quite curiously, Fallon said Russia is holding snap exercises frequently near international borders, while, of course, some of those watching the situation closely would argue the opposite, that NATO is, in fact, coming closer and closer to Russian territories, moving ever closer to the country.
All right, we will be hearing more on this from Daniel Kaczynski, member of Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the UK Parliament, a little later in the program, hopefully. So we will get you an update on this story. In the meantime, let's get to our breaking news story from Paris. Well, security situation in Europe is remaining fragile, and much of the reaction from French politicians so far has been critical of Donald Trump and his relation with Europe. Political analyst Nikola Mirkovic is joining me now live to discuss what's happening in more detail. Thanks so much for joining us here on International. Well, a few hours ago, President Hollande praised France's defense policy. What do you make of the timing of that statement, given what happened in Paris today?
Well, I think that's, of course, a bad timing for Mr. Hollande. Now, we have to have a little bit more information to understand exactly what went on this morning. Is this really a terrorist attack? Is this a lone wolf type of scenario? Or is this an organized terrorist attack? So I think it's now a bit maybe too early to say. Of course, in the media tonight, everybody's going to be, this afternoon already, people are going to relate what happened this morning under the Louvre and François Hollande's statement. So this is never good timing for a political statement, but it's a bit too early to say that this is a terrorist attack, mate.
Well, certainly people will be coming to grips with what happened for quite some time. But looking at the political landscape in France now, we are 3 months before presidential elections. So is today's attack likely to influence the race for the presidency?
Of course, because this is going to be under the spotlight. Everybody's going to be talking about this. This is a major event. We've seen that already. Donald Trump tweeted about what happened this morning in Paris. People are going to be speaking about this, and related to this issue, we have the issues of terrorism. We have the issues of Islam. We will have the issues of immigration. So these are some of the major elements today in the French political sphere. These are some of the elements which the French are the most concerned with. So this is going to be in the following days. Everybody's going to be speaking about these attacks, and all the political candidates will be summoned to give their opinion on what they would do once elected as president against terrorism. What will they would do on immigration? What will they do on integration? So this is definitely going to be a major event in the French presidential campaign.
Well, certainly these are all very hotly debated issues, and it's not always easy to find unity on these issues. Trump's controversial travel ban, for example, and how it was received in Europe, the ban to curb the terror threat, as he says, has come under harsh criticism in Europe, for example. But In light of what happened today and continued attacks, do you think the EU will eventually embrace perhaps a tougher, more Trump-like stance? What are the chances there?
I don't think this is something which is going to happen because, well, so far the EU has had a, I would say, light stance on these subjects. They haven't done anything so far. They've been quite critical on Trump's attitude in the recent weeks on banning people coming from countries where there is a we suspect that terrorists could arrive from. I don't see them because if we look at the European Union's policies in these past years, they've been quite light on the subject, and I don't see a radical turn today because the people who are in power today in the European Union don't seem to have that kind of stance. They have more of a laissez-faire, and whether it be the migrant issues, which has been a catastrophe on national levels and the EU level, whether it is terrorism, where we see there's a lot of difficulties between the police and the military of the different EU members coordinating. Don't forget that after the Berlin truck attack, we had a truck driver who went freely from one country to another, who went to France, then who went to Italy, with no coordination whatsoever between EU members. So, and that is the results of the EU's policy concerning Schengen, concerning different matters related to immigration and to terrorism. Seeing them today take a radical stance, that would be some sort of surprise, because this would be against the nature of those who are in power today in the European Union. So I think they just want to hide this under the rug, but this is something which cannot be hidden anymore.
Well, certainly a lot of questions there and issues to address. But just 2 days ago, European Council President Donald Tusk named Trump, China, Russia and terrorism as a major threats to European stability, you know, all in one group. How justified is that position?
That is totally ridiculous. EU has problems which are linked to the EU, and this scapegoat policy, blaming Trump, blaming China, blaming Russia, is nonsense. I think any political analyst would say this is ridiculous. I don't see how Mr. Tusk can say this and keep a straight face. EU has problems because they cannot manage the situation today. The EU is blowing up. It's tearing apart. Don't forget that Great Britain is now going to leave the EU. We've got surveys all across the EU, in France and Italy, with countries who want to leave the EU. We've got Poland and Hungary who themselves want to have their own policies within the EU. So I think this is more, we're looking at maybe the end of the EU as we know it today. There are too many flaws, too many problems. The European Union is the economic zone in the world which has the lowest growth. It's got endemic problems linked to massive unemployment, linked to migration, linked to crime, and the EU cannot settle these problems. So I think this is just, rather than taking the blame and trying to find solutions, trying to change maybe the system, change their own system, because 80% of the laws voted today within the European Union come from the European Union. So, I mean, we know that this is strong policies from Brussels, and they cannot manage the problems. So rather than saying, okay, we're going to sell it themselves, I'm going to change the EU, they're blaming other countries, and this is just outright ridiculous, and this is not helping, definitely not helping the EU's image, au contraire.
Well, Nicola, thanks so much for talking to us. Certainly, there are a lot of issues there that have been remaining unresolved for quite some time. But let's hope, as you were saying, for some unity and coordination there among the EU members. Political analyst Nicola Markovic talking to us here on RT International. And now let's go back to one of our top stories that we are following for you here today. And that's the UK's Defence Secretary, who has warned of a resurgent Russia and said that it is becoming aggressive. Michael Fallon made the comments as he addressed a group of university students. To discuss this further, I'm now joined by Daniel Kaczynski, a member of Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the UK Parliament. Ms. Kaczynski, thanks so much for joining us here on RT International. So, as we've heard, Michael Fallon has given a long accusatory speech against Russia, but it seems he didn't quite have all his facts in order, did he?
Well, I can understand the carrot and stick approach that is needed towards Russia, but at the moment we're only getting stick, and there doesn't seem to be any carrot. more and more confrontation, sanctions, and rhetoric against Russia, whilst we're not actually trying to engage with them to try to lower tensions. This is very, very concerning for me and an increasing number of Conservative members of Parliament. I'm particularly pleased with the Hungarian approach, and today I was reading about how President Putin has been invited and greeted in Budapest. Hungary is one of the frontline states between NATO and Russia, and yet its government has a very pragmatic view. Strength through NATO, increased defense spending, a robust, strong attitude towards Russia, but dialogue. And that's the sort of approach that we ought to be going for, rather than this ratcheting up of tensions, as I've spoken about to you on many occasions before.
Well, certainly strong, robust dialogue, as you said, as opposed to isolation, as some of the EU member states and other countries in the West have been pushing for. Now, speaking about the issue of fake news, which hit the headlines on a daily basis, now we have a top UK official with questionable facts. So what can we read into that?
Well, the most important thing to remember is that there are people in this country who want to engage with Russia in all sorts of different spheres, whether it's military, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's politicians, academics, professionals, and we want to engage with Russia in order so that we can test one another privately and publicly, and so that we can try to dispel some of the myths that are being created about our bilateral relationship. We can only really genuinely challenge one another about facts and about figures, statistics and intentions if we engage with one another and we probe one another and we try to build up some sort of a relationship which actually allows us to probe and test one another, even privately, behind closed doors as well as publicly. It takes years and years to build up that sort of trust where you can challenge one another. Trust but verify is an old adage of President Reagan's.
Well, certainly, but you know, there's another adage
today.
Yeah, there's another adage of there is a will, there is a way. So let's hope there is more political will on both sides to promote the dialogue, as you said, robust and strong. Well, going back to Mr. Fallon. And in his speech, he played down Russia's anti-terror effort in Syria. He also said Russia's military drills were a threat. But look, at the same time, we are seeing a massive buildup of NATO forces on Russia's border. So what is that, if not a double standard approach?
There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the carnage and the civil war in Syria, which has led to hundreds of thousands of lives being lost, has in part been solidified and added to by the lack of understanding and engagement between the world's two superpowers. And that's something which I think future generations have to think about very carefully. What are the ramifications of this Cold War-like-esque approach to one another? What are the costs in terms of human lives lost when you have the two major powers in the world not trusting one another and not cooperating with one another? But to answer your point about the missile deployment, look, I went to the Russian-Polish border last summer during the holidays, and that is already becoming the most highly militarized part of Europe. If the tit-for-tat deployment of missiles from both sides continues at the pace and trajectory that it has done over the last few years, this area is going to become the equivalent of the North and South Korean border, a no man's land. And then how do we get back from that cliff edge? How do we get back from that cliff edge? What are the levers in place to try to rein in the escalating tension? It's a very serious situation, and I appeal, and I continue to appeal to my leader, Theresa May, and other Western leaders to show the leadership and vision that it will take for a great statesman to actually engage with their Russian counterparts. Yes, we see things differently. Yes, we have wildly contrasting perspectives on many issues. But as fellow permanent members of the UN Security Council, it is our duty and responsibility to work constructively together to try, at least make an attempt to try to ease tensions.
Well, certainly, let's hope there will be more openness and desire to talk to each other. As, for example, the new Trump administration appears more open to cooperation with Russia, whereas the UK is still standing firm. Daniel Kaczynski, member of Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the UK Parliament, thanks so much for talking to us and giving us your thoughts. Well, let's now get back to our breaking news story, and that is the incident that happened in Paris earlier. With the security situation in Europe remaining very fragile, the French President François Hollande has taken aim at President Trump's policies, warning him to keep his nose out of the EU's internal affairs.
We in France have a defence policy. We fear nothing. We must have a European conception of our future. If not, there will be, in my opinion, no Europe, and not necessarily any way for each of the countries to be able to exert an influence in the world.
Well, we have Nadira Tudor in the studio, who's been following the story for us all day today. Nadira, it seems like François Hollande is not the only person, not the only leader, I should say, who's ringing the alarm bells over Trump.
Well, there's certainly a lot of words being thrown around at the moment. Just recently, at the end of January, the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, also said something quite similar. He said the new threat to the EU is Trump's America, and that was in response to the imposed Muslim ban. That's been a bid to fight terror. And if you look at that sentence alone, it looks like a comparison, equalization of Trump's administration to radical Islam, despite the fact that he's put measures in place to try and fight terrorism, and we can hear what Tusk said.
Today we are dealing with threats which have previously not occurred, and increasingly, let's call it assertive China, especially on the seas, Russia's aggressive policy towards Ukraine and its neighbors, wars, terror and anarchy in the Middle East and in Africa, with radical Islam playing a major role, as well as worrying declarations by the new American administration.
Strong words indeed. So we thought we'd put this to the test on the streets of Paris and see what the reaction was with regards to Trump's administration being a threat to the EU. And it was strange to see the echoing of Tusk's words. Let's have a look.
I think it's the United States, of course.
Why America?
Donald Trump. Donald Trump?
Because you don't know how he wants to manage his politics.
Probably Russia. There.
Anything else?
Well, maybe the U.S. right now, since Trump.
Since Trump, right. Oh, he definitely is a threat.
Yeah.
Because of all the things that he says. And I don't know how he wants to make them true, but I don't know, he'll figure out a way.
Now that Donald Trump is in charge, maybe it could be a big threat.
It is odd when you look at the reactions there on the streets, especially when you look at the attack on the Louvre Museum in Paris, that terrorism really should be seen as a main threat. Now, Trump has reacted on Twitter. This is what he said. A new radical Islamic terrorist has just attacked in Louvre Museum in Paris. Tourists were locked down. France on edge again. Get smart, US.
Right, Nadira, thanks so much for keeping an eye on what's been happening there and the social media as well, and bringing us this latest tweet from Donald Trump. Nadira Tudor here in the studio. Much of the reaction from French politicians so far has been in praise of the quick response of the security personnel, which helped prevent a far worse outcome.
Bravo to the soldier who neutralized the Islamist attacker at the Louvre. Let's not lower our guard against terrorists.
Support for our soldiers. More than 3 months of weakness and ineffectiveness, and we will conduct a total war against Islamism.
Indestructible support for our armed forces, the safety of the French people is our objective.
In these very difficult times, all our thoughts go out to the forces of law and order who risk their lives to defend us.
Now, the attack came despite France being under a state of emergency for more than a year now. It was declared after the November 2015 attacks in the capital and has been extended 4 times. France has not been the only EU country that's been confronted with terror head-on.
Unless you put a complete lockdown on every major European city, someone like this, who appears to be a homegrown terrorist, someone who, I'm guessing, but I think was born and brought up in France with no previous record, is going to get through, going to attack a soft target like the Louvre or another tourist attraction. It's if this was carried out by someone who has been in Syria or Iraq, like a litany of other cases, then there are serious questions as to why these people are slipping back into Europe. After all, the border with Turkey is closely monitored. It's very difficult to get into Syria or Iraq without being monitored by the security forces, and conversely, it should be very easy for those people to pick them up. We have to ask questions about why, if it is the case, this is someone who has been in Syria or Iraq, how they got back.
In France, the deadliest terror attacks have taken place with a socialist government in power. And just months before the presidential election, another apparent terror act has occurred. Well, our correspondent Nikki Aaron joins me now in the studio to discuss this in more detail, and specifically how the current socialist government is addressing these issues. And given the timing that we are only, well, in fact, less than 3 months away from presidential elections.
Well, like you said, the timing is particularly significant with this latest terror attack. That's because in just 3 months from now, the French people are going to head to the polls to choose their next president. And it'll be interesting to see how and if this attack will impact on the choice of the people. One thing's for certain, this is likely to be the final nail in the coffin for the Socialist Party. This marks the 4th terror attack on French soil under their watch, leading to a loss of faith among the French people. Starting with the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January 2015, which killed 130 people, 12 people, then the Paris attacks, which killed 130 people, and then followed by the Bastille Day attack in Nice, which killed 84 people. All incidents which contributed to President Hollande's popularity plummeting. He's now tagged with the label Mr. 4% in reference to his unpopular rating. He's been called the most unpopular French president since the Second World War. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister Manuel Valls caused outrage when he told the French people this.
Times have changed, and we should learn to live with terrorism.
And these are words which have impacted heavily on how the people see the socialists and trust their policies. So, if the ruling party have lost favour, what alternatives do the French people have? Well, until about 2 weeks ago, the clear favourite was the Republican Francois Fillon. But now he finds himself at the centre of a scandal after newspaper claims that his wife Penelope was paid some €1 million for a job that there's actually little evidence of her doing. An investigation has been opened opened, but even if no evidence is found, the damage may have already been done. We've seen his reputation take a major hit, with his popularity rating really plummeting to 38%. But one candidate who may see this terror attack work in her favour is the National Front's Marine Le Pen. Quite a controversial figure for her stance on migrants, among other things, but controversial no longer means impossible. After all, the outspoken non-PC Donald Trump has just been voted President of the United States, and his stance on migrants, along with his recent travel ban, are things which Marine Le Pen has openly praised. So there is a chance that these are the kinds of policies that the French people could view now in a different light, if this means France will become safer.
All right, Nikki, thanks so much for bringing us this update. So such is the political landscape in France ahead of the presidential elections. Now, EU leaders have agreed on a plan to stem migration from North Africa at a summit in Malta. And they also discussed the problems Donald Trump's administration is posing for them. Many slammed his recent ban on migration from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. Well, we can now talk to Peter Oliver to discuss this meeting. Hello there, Peter. So what has been decided at the summit?
Right, now this is a proposal that's been agreed on by the EU top brass and all of the national leaders. What it'll see is a similar type of project put in place to the Turkey refugee return deal that we've seen in the past. Not that that deal has worked perfectly, mind. What it will see is trying to put in place an incentive not to travel across the Libyan desert and not to try and cross the Mediterranean over to Italy. The way that they're going to try and implement this is there's going to be a massive amount of naval support provided from EU nations. There's also going to be around 200 million euros worth of aid put in place as well. This is something that Donald Tusk, the European Council president, wanted to see. It seems so far it's going his way.
Our main goal for the Malta summit is to stem the flow of irregular migration from Libya to Europe.
Well, there's been a lot of flack for Donald Trump at the Valletta conference that's underway in Malta at the moment. But this isn't something that's been anything new. Over the past few days, MEPs in Brussels have been saying that Donald Trump's policy to ban or temporarily suspend migration to the United States from 7 majoritively Muslim nations was bang out of order. Let's have a listen to what was said in Brussels just this week.
A travel ban can maybe give a temporary illusion of addressing the issue, but it can only create more frustration and anger.
It's about, fueling populism and nationalism for the moment, what the Trump administration is doing.
This is apparently how liberal democracy dies.
Well, among those in Valletta today on Friday, adding their voices to that choir, have been the Austrian Chancellor Christian Kern, him saying that he's deeply unhappy with the way that, that Donald Trump is conducting himself on the international stage. However, well, this has come in for some big flack, particularly from Trump supporters and, well, exactly from Trump supporters. They're accusing the EU top brass of, well, hypocrisy, really. They're saying that the deal that they're trying to establish right now, that looks like they've got across the line in Malta to stop the migration wave from Africa, from North Africa, over to Italy, is exactly the same as what Donald Trump is put in place. We heard just a few seconds ago from the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Federica Mogherini. She's now said that her policy is completely in line with the UN. However, it's not going to go away. As long as the EU stops this, continues to do this, they're going to come in for criticism from Trump supporters.
Well, Peter, it has certainly been an exciting meeting there. A lot has come out of it. Thanks so much for bringing us up to speed on this one. Peter Oliver there from Berlin. And up next on RT International, it's Crosstalk. Just stay with us.